Stand in Stockholm today, and you can walk straight up to a complete, fully rigged 17th century warship, close enough to touch her original hull planking. 98% of what you're looking at was never rebuilt, restored, or replaced. The actual wood, the actual ship. She sank in broad daylight on the afternoon she was launched, in full view of the crowd that came to watch her leave harbour, and never sailed again. The only reason any of that original wood survived 4 centuries is the water she sank into. This is the Vasa. The Vasa was built to be the most heavily armed warship afloat, and on the day she finally sailed in 1628, she rolled over and went down in full view of the harbour she had just left. No enemy touched her. Too much weight stacked too high on too narrow a hull, and a gust of wind did the rest. She sat on the harbour floor for over 3 centuries before anyone raised her again. This is that actual hull, raised in 1961 and now standing in the Vasa Museum. Wood-eating shipworms, the marine mollusk that reduces most sunken wooden ships to scattered timber within decades, cannot survive in the Baltic's low salt content, so her structure simply never had a predator. The museum now controls humidity and temperature constantly, protection the harbour water once provided for free. The Vasa capsized so new her paint was barely dry, and the reason is chemistry. Fresh rivers feed the Baltic faster than its narrow straits can drain salt back in, leaving it far less salty than the open ocean. That single fact does almost all the work here. Cold slows decay everywhere in the deep sea. Low salt in the Baltic starves out the one organism that would otherwise have hollowed her out. This is her stern, carved with roughly 700 wooden sculptures, lions, warriors, and royal symbols meant to insult the enemies of the Swedish crown before she had fired a single shot in anger. Even the surviving paint pigments trace back to that same cold, low-oxygen water. The Baltic Sea will not support shipworm, the wood-eating mollusk that reduces most sunken ships to scattered timber. And that single fact is the whole reason the Vasa survived intact, enough to be raised in 1961. So the verdict on the Vasa is fully explained. A top-heavy design, a gust of wind, and water too fresh for the one organism that eats ships. The wood is real. The water saved it. The Mary Rose sank in 1545 in the Solent, the strait between Portsmouth and the Isle of Wight, while sailing out to meet a French invasion fleet the English crown had watched approach for days. This is the ship, as she looked before she sank, drawn in 1546 for King Henry VIII's own inventory of his fleet, the Anthony Roll, one of the only visual records of her that survives. Roughly 500 men were aboard when she went down. A letter written to the Holy Roman Emperor within days put survivors at only 2 or 3 dozen. Most of the crew never made it off the ship at all. One side of her hull settled into the Solent seabed and was quickly sealed under a thick layer of oxygen-starved silt. The other side stayed exposed to open water, and open water does not forgive wood. Marine organisms and simple erosion stripped that exposed upper side down to almost nothing over 4 centuries, while the buried side sat sealed away from oxygen, untouched, waiting for someone to eventually come looking. When divers finally found her in 1971, half the ship was essentially gone, and half was astonishingly intact. One single hull that split into 2 entirely different outcomes. The recovered hull sits inside the Mary Rose Museum in Portsmouth today, but the trust that runs it does not release free photographs of it, so this is not that hull, just the water that decided its fate. So the Mary Rose stays genuinely disputed in the small print. The crew count still varies by source, and conservators argue how much buried timber can ever be fully stabilized. The split is not in question. On the morning of 7th of June 1692, Port Royal, Jamaica was one of the wealthiest ports in the English colonies, built almost entirely on a sand spit, packed with brick buildings and thousands of people. That morning, the ground itself gave way. Within minutes, close to 2/3 of the town, about 33 acres, slid into the harbour, buildings and streets going under largely intact beneath the water. This contemporary engraving, printed within years of the disaster, shows the town collapsing into the sea in real time. Not a metaphor, an eyewitness-informed rendering of buildings sliding into the harbor. Port Royal sank because of liquefaction. Waterlogged sand loses its footing under strong shaking and briefly behaves like a liquid. So a building does not topple over. It sinks straight down, upright. Divers later recovered ordinary household objects still sitting in place on sunken streets, including a stopped pocket watch. No free photograph of that specific object exists to show you here. About 2,000 people died in the earthquake and the wave that followed it. Roughly 3,000 more died from injury and disease in the weeks after, in a town that had lost most of its housing and its harbor in one morning. This 1671 map shows Port Royal, Jamaica, 2 decades before the earthquake that sank most of it. A real town, not a legend, with real streets still down there today, buried instead of burned. The mechanism is fully explained and geologically ordinary. It just happened to a whole city instead of a single ship. A buried street preserves its floor plan the same way a buried hull preserves its timber. In 1915, pack ice slowly crushed Ernest Shackleton's ship Endurance in the Weddell Sea before she had gone a single mile toward Antarctica, and she sank completely out of sight for the next 107 years. This is the ship herself, photographed by expedition photographer Frank Hurley while she was still trapped, months before the ice finally broke her hull apart entirely. Before she went down, navigator Frank Worsley took sextant readings by hand and recorded the ship's position in his own logbook. An ordinary act of seamanship nobody on board expected to matter more than a century later. The Weddell Sea itself is part of the reason nothing about this sank into legend. 3,000 meters down, permanently cold and dark, far from the currents and organisms that break a wooden hull apart everywhere else. In March 2022, a search team found the wreck sitting upright on the seafloor about 4 miles from Worsley's recorded position. Those survey images belong to the expedition's own trust and are not freely licensed, so this is not that footage, just the water it was found in. This is Endurance again, photographed by Hurley in her final hours, crew and sled dogs still standing on the ice around her as she went down for good. This period map traces Endurance's actual route on the Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition, published within a year of her sinking, the same voyage whose handwritten coordinates led searchers back to the wreck a century later. So Endurance is explained twice over. Cold, dark, oxygen-starved water preserved the wood, and one navigator's handwriting preserved the address. Neither one required a myth to do its job. 2 Royal Navy ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, left England in 1845 searching for a northwest passage through the Arctic, got trapped in pack ice for 2 winters straight, and every man aboard both of them eventually died. This is the actual note left behind in a stone cairn in 1848. The crew's own account of their captain's death and their decision to abandon ship and try to walk south across the ice. 129 men set out. Search parties over the following decades recovered scattered relics, tools, and written records, but never found either ship. Both stayed missing for another century and a half. The wrecks themselves finally turned up in 2014 and 2016, remarkably intact, sitting in shallow, brutally cold Arctic water that had kept both hulls largely undisturbed since the day each one finally settled onto the seabed. This 1845 illustration shows both ships departing England, fully crewed and provisioned, with no reason yet to expect they were sailing toward the ice that would eventually preserve them. Finding the Franklin expedition's ships, Erebus and Terror, remarkably well preserved did not answer the real question. What killed 129 trained, provisioned men before any could walk to safety? These are real recovered relics from the expedition, traded by local Inuit hunters to a search party decades after the crews vanished. Physical evidence, not folklore, of exactly how far some men got. Researchers have proposed lead exposure, scurvy, starvation, and tuberculosis, and the chemical evidence for lead is real but genuinely disputed as a cause on its own. The ships are the best preserved wrecks in this entire episode, and the question stays completely open. Those 5 are the deep dives, verified sites, verified mechanisms. 4 more deserve real airtime too. Shorter stories, same rule. Only what is actually documented gets to stay on screen. This royal decree stele, carved under Pharaoh Nectanebo I, is a near twin of one raised underwater at Thonis-Heracleion. Matching text between the two is exactly how archaeologists confirmed the sunken city's real name. Thonis-Heracleion sank gradually over centuries near the Nile Delta as waterlogged clay beneath the city slowly gave way under its own weight. The same liquefaction mechanism as Port Royal, just stretched across hundreds of years instead of minutes, with earthquakes and rising water speeding the process along at several points. Researchers still argue over how much of the sinking was gradual settling versus sudden localized collapse events triggered by earthquakes, so the exact timeline stays disputed, even though the underlying mechanism itself is well documented. Off the coast of southern Greece sits Pavlopetri, a Bronze Age town whose streets, courtyards, and building foundations are still laid out on the seabed exactly as they stood roughly 3,000 years ago. No free photograph of the actual site exists to show you here. The shallow water it sits in is exactly why it survived at all, since nothing ever buried it deep enough for later construction on land to destroy it. Earthquakes gradually dropped this coastline below sea level over centuries. The town plan itself is fully explained, an entire settlement's layout preserved by the same subsidence that sank it. Around 1320 BC, a merchant ship went down off the coast of what is now Turkey, carrying one of the richest cargoes ever recovered from the ancient world, and almost none of her wooden hull survived to be found. This is one of roughly 350 copper ingots from that cargo, shaped like an ox hide for easy carrying, now on display at the Bodrum Museum of Underwater Archaeology. This reconstruction at the same museum shows roughly where that cargo sat inside the hull. About 10 tons of copper and a ton of tin outlasted the wood around them, so the cargo mapped the wreck the hull no longer could. Explained, and one of the best documented wrecks in this whole episode. Below about 150 meters, the Black Sea simply runs out of oxygen entirely, and a 2018 survey used that fact to find over 60 ancient and medieval shipwrecks resting on the seabed down there. The oldest confirmed wreck found in that survey is a Greek trading vessel roughly 2,400 years old. The survey's own imagery is rights reserved, so no free photograph of that specific hull exists to show here. No oxygen means no wood-eating organisms, full stop. The mechanism is explained, and it is the simplest one in the entire episode. The deep water down there simply never got the chance to destroy anything at all. 9 real sites, 9 real mechanisms, checked against the actual record. The Vasa survived because the Baltic is too fresh for shipworm. The Mary Rose split into 2 outcomes and stays genuinely disputed in its details. Port Royal sank the same way a hull rots, just faster, and to a whole city instead of a ship. Endurance was found because deep cold water and one navigator's handwriting both did their jobs. And the Franklin expedition's ships are the best preserved wrecks here, and still cannot answer the one question that actually matters. If verified wrecks and the actual mechanisms behind them are worth your time, subscribe. There are more real sites waiting, and some of their answers are still open.